Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the workshop. It is fantastic to have you here as ever, because today is part 6 of working on a Viking sword. And what I need to do today is I need to get this bevel finally ground in to 120 grit. We're then going to move to the slack belt, and we're going to grind it on the slack belt so that we get a nice convex, appleseed, strong edge for the Viking sword before we move all the way up to an A30 Trizact finish. So let's jump right back into the grinding room and get back to it. It feels great. Right now it is 568 grams, 1 pound and 4 ounces, and it is looking fine. This is off the grinder at an A30 Trizact finish, roughly equivalent to an 800 grit, but that's a machine finish, which means that it is not good enough for an etch, because our grind lines go this way, and so we need to hand sand it. Lots of people ask, why don't you just grind stuff in? Why do you go to hand sanding? The reason is, for an etch on a fine piece, you need an extremely consistent single scratch pattern that's going to go from here all the way down to the edge. We need the accuracy of being able to hand sand these edges without them bleeding too much, and that continuous true 4, 6, sometimes 800 grit finish is exactly what it takes to make sure that after an etch you end up with the best piece possible. And sadly, I have not found anything to substitute hand sanding. There are ways to make the hand sanding process go a little faster using a disc sander when you're doing a flat grind. Here it's convex. There is no other thing that we can do to help this get done than be patient, use some good old-fashioned elbow grease, and use a hell of a lot of sandpaper. So now, where's Alex when you need him? Time for me to do a lot of hand sanding. 400 grit. Dirty 400 grit. Like it's close. There are a couple of things I'm going to touch up. I'm going to have to drop back down to 320 and then go up to 400. But it's just fabulous what hand sanding does. It cleans up the straightness of all of your lines. My fuller has now got this beautiful straightness to it, which I am just thrilled about. It takes away all of the mess-ups that happen at the grinder, where it's just so easy to slip and have there be an error. Makes the transitions so much nicer. Even back here, down where our fuller ends in the tang, where it doesn't need to look neat, it still looks neat. And I'm very pleased about that. I'm very pleased because this is the process of working towards having made a project that just keeps going up and up and up in terms of the quality. So that's very exciting. From now on the blade, we're pretty much ready to put it to the side and start working on other things. But we do need to make sure that our tang is shaped a little more like how it's going to end up. First thing though, I want to talk a little bit about this blade shape. How did this come about? How did this Type 3, what is it? I want to run you guys through it because I am finding it utterly fascinating, completely fascinating, and it's opening up a whole new world and a whole new focus of study and intrigue for me, which I really like. So I'm going to try and drop some links in the description to some Amazon affiliate links for the Swords of the Viking Age book. This is by Ian Pearce, and it's been one of my kind of really handy references for this project, and specifically the typology within. Alec, what is a typology? Haha! Well, historians who have studied the topic of swords in different areas have put together what they call a typology, which basically it compiles swords from a certain time period that have a certain characteristic, and they consider that a type. And studying the provenance of the different swords and how those blade shapes change over time means that they end up with a set of different characteristics, whether it's blade shape, blade style, blade length, blade thickness, how the distal taper works. They've got these things characterized into different types. A very famous typology is the Oakshott Typology. I'm pretty sure it's the same guy who wrote this book, Oakshott. That typology describes how the medieval swords changed over time and how there were different types through time and, yada, yada, yada. It's utterly fascinating how it classifies them, and it means that for makers today that want to study and work on a certain type of sword, they can say, okay, from Oakshott's typology, I want to make a Type 12 sword. And they can look in his typology or look in his book, and they'll go, okay, this is kind of how a Type 12 looks, and there are different variations there might be. On screen now is the typology that you'll probably be familiar with when you type in a sword typology, and this is also Oakshott's typology, and it shows all the different types there are, and it's extremely helpful to classify swords. And what it also does is it provides an amazing insight based on the provenance and the point in time that a different sword was popular. It has an amazing insight on the fighting styles of the time, how it is that swords were used, how it is that they represented what culture was at the time, how it represented the styles of war and battle that were fought. It's an unbelievable insight into history, and it helps to make a picture behind an individual sword shape very, very much more interesting. It gives an unbelievable amount of extra meaning to what this is. So, coming on to Viking swords, the typology that I have been referencing for my swords has been the Brigade Classification that you can see here on this page, and it's Type 1 to Type 5, and it illustrates only the blade shape, and you'll see that Type 1 was more popular in the 7th to 8th century, and then the Type 5 was more popular in the 10th to 11th century. And you'll see that those blade shapes evolve from a Type 1 that is thicker and clunkier and shorter, where the point of balance on the blade would be closer towards the tip due to the increased width, where there is less point, where the blade would excel more at chopping and a big chopping blow because of that extra mass up here than its later Type 3, Type 4, Type 5 sister swords. And that progression all the way down to the Type 5 is that largely from Type 2, the blade getting more of a taper, to Type 3, what we were aiming at, more of a taper, and a fuller as well that comes up a little ways out towards the tip, to the Type 4, even more taper, and the Type 5 Brigade Classification sword looks very much like the medieval swords that we're familiar with after the Viking Age, a much more slender taper. And what does that mean? Go watch some Peter Johnson videos and learn what he has to say about this, because he knows his stuff. But in short, my understanding is it means that you have more dexterity with the sword. It means that you can move the sword faster, and the sword is more nimble. The sword becomes more of an extension of your hand as opposed to an edge on a stick. And it becomes a response to the evolution in fighting techniques, to the increased speed and skill that your opponents would have, that sword shape evolved. It's fascinating because that sword shape might have been a response to the fighting style. It might have been that the fighting styles changed as the sword styles changed. I don't know, but that evolution took a huge amount of time. It took hundreds of years for this change in blade shape. And I find that utterly fascinating because we think back to the last 120 years, how fighting has changed, how war has changed. The progression of these 120 years has been monumentous in comparison to this. And that's remarkable because, of course, we're advancing at just an unbelievable rate now. But it's also remarkable because, well, if they used the same blade shape for a couple hundred years, there was probably a reason for it. And now that I've made a blade that is pretty close to a Type 3, Type 4 blade, that has similar thickness and an appropriate amount of distal taper for the period, and as I hold that in my hand, even without all of the fittings, just like the falchion. There is also a typology on the falchion written by our friend James Elmsley, who helped us make it. Similar to the falchion, where when I made it, I knew, yes, this is how it should have felt. This is how they would have designed it. With this, I hold it and I go, yes, this is what they wanted. This feels much more nimble. It feels like it can chop. It feels like it can stab. It feels like it has a lot more character to it than a lot of my previous work. So much of my previous work, uninformed by history and uninformed by the wisdom of our forefathers, has been clunky and has been heavy and has not felt like something that could be an extension of your hand. The people that made these blades historically, they knew what it was that they were making, and they had to do a good job of making it because the people that used them knew what they wanted to work for the fighting styles that they used. It shows my naivety from when I started making swords, where I was just making a long piece of steel with an edge on it, and I was surprised that, wow, it doesn't really feel that nice to wield. It doesn't feel like you'd want to do anything with this. And then, of course, you pick up something that's a lot more in line with the real thing, and yeah, the guys that came before us, our forefather craftsmen, they knew what it was that they were creating, and it makes it so fascinating to me to have dipped my toes into this history and now dipped my toes into making something more historically appropriate, because now this is not just a sword, this is a sword with meaning behind it. It is a sword that has life when you hold it in your hands, and that's just a really beautiful thing. For it to have life in my hand, it's gonna eventually need some work done on the back end. And so for that, we need to get that tang down to an appropriate thickness, because it now tapers the wrong way. We need to get this tang tapering the other way so the fittings can actually go on from this direction. So it's into the grinding room, on with the spacesuit. It feels good. It's time to grind the tang. Right guys, we're going to call it there for today's episode. I hope you've enjoyed it. It's been a pleasure as always bringing you along. I'm tired from the hand sanding, but I'm pleased to be making progress, and I can't wait to see you on the next episode with a little more progress on the sword. Thank you very much. Hit subscribe if you're new. Grab yourself a fabulous t-shirt like this steel buoy at alecsteelshop.com, and I'm going to be seeing you very soon. Bye-bye.